sandy footsteps, cracking celery, tasing grapes, aliens from outer space. You have to be quiet in this place. Hello and welcome back to another episode of Easily Entertained. I'm your host, Bryson, and today we are talking about A Quiet Place. But before we get into that, please give us a follow and a like, depending on which platform you're on, so that you can get notified of all the latest updates and episodes. Yeah, I know what I'm saying. But yeah, today we are talking about A Quiet Place. So granted, A Quiet Place isn't exactly a very new movie. There are two movies in the franchise. It's A Quiet Place and A Quiet Place 2, both directed by John Krasinski, or as everyone kind of knows him, Jim Halpert from The Office, but we love it. These movies are fantastic. So the basic premise is both movies really focus around one family. It's the Abbott family. I bet you actually didn't really know that. It's not very apparent in the movies. They don't really talk about it all that much. In the second movie, they actually give more names to the characters. I think in the first one, there's only a couple times where names may be said, and I think it's usually the son, which his name is Marcus. He's played by Noah Jupe. And to give you a rundown of the rest of the names, you have John Krasinski's character, Lee. You have Emily Blunt, John Krasinski's wife, and his wife in the movie as well. Her name is Evelyn. And Millicent Simmons, who plays Reagan, who is the daughter, who is deaf in the movie, and she's deaf in real life. And funny enough, she is actually from Utah, which is pretty crazy. That's so cool. Which, if you didn't know, that's where I'm from, and that's where I'm assuming most of my listener base, at least right now, is from. So that's kind of cool. She's from here. She's kind of like a local celebrity, essentially. I don't remember the exact area. I think it's up north, probably around the Salt Lake area, but I couldn't tell you for sure. But I know she's from Utah, which is cool. But anyway, so this show, this 2-movie series, it centers around this family, and they're in a sort of post-apocalyptic world. Not in the sense that we have nuclear fallout or mass genocide from war, but instead mass genocide from aliens that crashed on an asteroid. It's explained a lot more in the second movie, but in the first movie, you mainly get it through newspaper clippings on the walls, and so that's kind of how you figure it out. It's these creatures that are blind, but they have incredibly good hearing, and they're armored and are vicious. They kill pretty much anything that makes sound. So naturally, why it's called A Quiet Place is because everyone has to be quiet. You don't want to make any sound. And so sound plays a huge part in this film. They did that off from the start. They wanted sound to play a huge part of this, and that's actually a real reason why John Krasinski, who I believe wrote the screenplay as well, wanted a deaf character. Which is where Millicent Simmons comes into play. Because she's deaf, they wanted this character to be deaf. I believe John wrote the story with a deaf character in mind, because that kind of makes sense. You have these opposites of the villains of the story, which are like the aliens, the deaf angels, as they are called. They are never stated that in the movies, but everywhere that I can find, that's what they're called, at least in the fan base, I'm assuming, is that they're called death angels, which kind of makes sense. They fell from the heavens and they just murder everybody. That makes sense. I understand why they're called that. But so you have these death angels, which have hyper hearing. They can hear everything, to the tiniest bug to a giant explosion, and they hate the big loud sounds. It kind of hurts them, especially the high frequency ones. And then you have a character, Reagan, who is fully deaf. She can't hear anything. And that provides really good contrast to both sides of the story, because you have a villain who hears everything, and you have the protagonist who doesn't hear anything. And so you kind of have to go through this story with sound in mind. That's how the movie was made. And it's a really good example of something that I've talked about before in my WALL-E episode, which if you haven't listened to that one, go check it out. But it's wordless storytelling. So granted, there is dialogue in this movie because of sign language. They have to talk to each other that way because it is quiet. But because it's visual, it allows for different emotions that come out. And the sound designers, Ethan Van Der Rijn and Eric Odell, I believe I'm pronouncing those right, they had that in mind because them and John Krasinski have that in mind. They wanted it to still give off lots of emotion without all that sound. In an interview John Krasinski had for the Los Angeles Times, he said, and this is a quote I have, is, "I figured if we could feel something without it, then I knew we had something." And that's really important. The lack of sound does not mean the lack of emotion. Because this movie has a lot of sound that is added, has a lot of Foley sound, which is sound that's added after production, because you can't always film all the sound that is on site, because it's not always going to sound good, because usually your primary focus is dialogue. Granted, they're not thinking about that in this, but you don't want a lot of background sound when you're recording actual sound. So they usually recreate sounds in a studio using a variety of different things. And we'll talk about that a little bit more. But so they wanted a lot of emotion without sound. They didn't want you to be hearing their voices break when they're scared or sad or angry. You wanted to see it. It's another example of that wordless visual storytelling. It is something that you have to witness. It's a show, don't tell kind of thing. Even with dialogue, they want you to see the emotion because that's all you can in this world. You can't make sound. And even watching this, I remember first watching it in the theater. You can't do anything. Like, everyone gets their popcorn and their drinks, and you go into the theater, and the movie starts off quiet. And you don't feel like you can eat or drink because you know there's a monster that goes to sound, no matter how small it is. And so having that big of an impact using sound, even with minimal sound, which it's not exactly minimal, but we'll explain that a little bit later, it makes a really powerful impact because your audience becomes a part of it. It's not something that you're just thinking, oh, they just cut out the sound. That's not going to be a big deal. No, they did it purposefully, and they did it in a way that would make the audience kind of uneased, which is the point. It's a thriller. And so it's very interesting that they did it that way. But for the story, which is an original story that is super captivating and one of like the best like thriller duologies that has come out in a long time, I think that's such a smart way to do it. And so to talk about that more in depth, we kind of have to talk about the sound design. And so I mentioned Foley, which is a lot of added sound that is usually recreated in a studio, not on site filming. It's usually done in post-production. So in this one, they had to create silence. And that may sound kind of stupid to say. Creating silence doesn't exactly make any sense, because silence is the opposite of sound, isn't it? Not necessarily. Think about when things are super quiet. There isn't an absence of sound. You just hear little sounds. And so in this movie, with all the absence of the big sounds, they have to bring these small sounds up. Think about the footsteps, leaves rustling, birds chirping, at least the ones that can fly away from the creatures. Those sounds are the sounds of silence. I know, like the song, the glorious sound of silence song. But it's very meticulously done to have the sound of silence. Like, even if I just go quiet here for a second, you may not be able to hear it as well, especially because I put like noise reduction and everything on this. I might try and remember to cut that part so that you can hear all the little sounds. But my computer is running, so I hear that going. I hear my notifications going off. I sometimes hear like the walls settling, the house settles. It's little things. Even if they're not big, you're never truly silent. And I don't know if this is exactly the case for people who fully can't hear anything. Like, my dad is fully deaf. I don't know if that means he doesn't have an ambience, essentially. Like, I don't know. It's something, because everyone experiences sound differently. And even if he's deaf, maybe his sound is like his thoughts, essentially. But I couldn't say that for sure. Dad, if you're watching this, because I do have this on YouTube, go check it out. Subscribe to the YouTube, and I have closed captions on. That would be interesting to know. But like, still, you can never have true silence. There is always something. So in this movie, they had to use a lot of Foley sounds to make all these small sounds amplified so that we could hear them and we kind of know what silence sounds like. A big one for this movie is the footsteps. They have a lot of emphasis on placing sand in this movie because it helps dampen sound. Because sound waves kind of disperse if there's a lot of surface area, essentially. So that may not be the right way to put it. So like a flat wall behind me, sound bounces off that really easily. And so to kind of combat that, so like sound studios, they usually have something that's made of cloth or have something with like a big geometrical shape. If you've ever seen like YouTube commentators or things like that, they'll have those foam panels in the back that kind of have like the ridges, essentially. Those are really good at sound dampening because they're made of material that helps to do that. So in like cloth, there's a lot of little fibers, and the sound disperses between those fibers rather than bouncing off a flat surface. And sand kind of works that same way. Like, you don't hear, like, you have like little crunching of sand, but it's not tons. It's quiet enough. And so they had to recreate that a lot in this movie because that's what they did. And they couldn't do that on site because you're going to have a lot of background sound. So they need a completely isolated room to add all these. But they then have to crank that up so that we can hear it. And so it's very interesting how all that works. And a lot of movies do this to kind of give the illusion of sound. And it's usually not something that you would actually associate with the sound. So I say like stepping on sand, that's actually really often used for snow steps. Like in movies with a lot of snow and they're walking through the snow, they don't actually use the snow to record that. Sometimes they do, but it's hard to do that once again on set if they're in an actual snowy place. So they recreate it using sand, and it adds that crunch, and it gives you the illusion that that's the sound it is. Or you see a waterfall. usually the sound is not actually a waterfall. It is water dropping, but it's way smaller. It's them like just pouring it into a little like tub, essentially. And so they have to recreate a lot of these sounds, and sometimes using things that you wouldn't expect. And so that kind of brings me into the Death Angels, because the Death Angels, although this movie is A Quiet Place, the Death Angels seem to make a lot of noise. They have their roars, they have their echolocation, even the movement of their bodies, because they're armored, so things kind of move around as if armored plates are shifting. And so they had to come up with creative ways to solve these challenges. They had to make up a creature, and so they had to make up ways to create the creature sounds. And so I think first we should talk about the movement, because I think that's pretty interesting on its own. Because of all the armor plates moving around and them kind of being sort of invertebrates, almost like bugs, essentially, their skeletons seem to be on the outside, because that's how they are. They have that protection on the outside, but I don't know, maybe they could be vertebrates and they're just super cool and have armor on the outside as well. But to get those kind of sounds of the armored plates kind of shifting around, the kind of stuff, I know that was such a good visual. They had to do things like cracking celery. So they take a celery stalk and twist it around, because you'd get some of the cracking sounds. And then also, if you've ever like eaten a full celery thing or like prepared it, you know, they kind of like squeak. So it's like kind of sounding. I'm doing so good at providing examples of what these sound like. But then you have the cracking of the celery. They would take crab legs, because, you know, they have the joints kind of similar to how the joints are on those creatures, and they creak those around and rattle them together, because that's something similar in our world that may, if it was upscaled to the size of a person, it may sound like that. And so they would do that. They would crush lettuce for different things like that. And so you'd get like the plates around their face that would shift and crack and all these things that you couldn't really do because it's a CGI monster. You can't just make up the sounds in real life. You can't get them from a real alien, at least not yet. But it's interesting because you have to do a lot of the movement, and you think that usually gets happened a lot for monster movies. The movement on its own is something that really has to be taken into account for. Think like Jurassic Park. Movement for them, it's usually footsteps, but you have to think their whole bodies are moving. It's slamming into the ground. You have to think their tails may be moving. It may be hitting branches or different things like that. They may have, because they're so big, you may almost hear their muscles moving and moving around. Yeah, like that makes sense, right? So you have the muscles like hitting the ground, of course, but also like them moving, like jiggling essentially, because they're so large and they move around. And so you kind of have to think a lot of work goes into sound design in movies, even for creatures, especially ones where we don't have them in real life, like dinosaurs or aliens. We can't just get an example from those. You have to kind of make them up and use your imagination. And especially in like the case of Jurassic Park, a lot of the dinosaur roars are usually taken from other animals. And in A Quiet Place, you have the echolocation, which uses a very interesting tactic to get that sound. Because you think they could have done things like recording a dolphin or a whale doing echolocation, or even a bat, because these creatures seem almost bat-like in their design. Kind of if you took a bat, you took off its wings, not like completely, but you took out the skin, so it was just like the skeletal type structure, and balded them, gave them armor. That's kind of what the Death Angels look like. They're kind of like bat type looking creatures, but they didn't use any animal sounds, at least for the echolocation. They don't actually explain how the roar was made. So I mentioned earlier their names, but just to remind you, the main audio engineers for the movie, they were Ethan Van der Rijn and Eric Odell. Which Odell sounds like audio sounds perfect for an audio engineer. But they, so there's like videos and interviews with them on how they made all the sounds. The roar, they never revealed how the roar was made for A Quiet Place. And I think that's good. They said this themselves. They wanted to leave it up for the imagination. Sometimes you want to keep secrets, and that's good. I don't think you need to know how everything is done. You can have an idea of what they did. Like, they probably combined some animal sounds, maybe some mechanical sounds, like the rest of the creature is made. And you have that so that things kind of sound unnatural, but they didn't explain exactly how, because that's just for them. They don't have to tell anybody. And I think that's genius. That's respect to the craft. They want to keep those secrets for themselves. And plus, it adds to the mystery and uneasiness of the creatures. We don't know how they made the sounds. Maybe they got a real one. But, so back to the echolocation. The way they did that, instead of recording a animal sound, they took grapes and a taser, and they put them together. They sent an electric current through grapes, and it made that. It's not a very good interpretation of it, but that clicking that they do is done through tasing grapes. And granted, if you think of like a taser sound, those are usually really fast. So although these are fast, they're deeper pitched. So they tased grapes and they slowed it way down, because even slowed down, it's still really fast. But that also adjusts the pitch, and so they're a lot deeper sounding, but they work as echolocation. And you would never think that's what it was. And that's such an interesting way. Like, you got to think, how did they think of that? How did someone go, let's taste some grapes, and that will sound like they're giving off some echolocation? Like, that is, like, as someone who does a little bit of directing, and I'm working on some, like a project for a film class myself, and I've done some audio engineering and trying to do creature sound and Foley, that kind of stuff, even understanding how you do it, it blows my mind, because you have to really put yourself outside the box. And I've done that myself, but for things like that, you have to, it is an unparalleled level of creativity where you're like, let's just send an electric current through a fruit and see what the sound it makes. And maybe we can use that. And they did it. Like, that is mind-blowing. It is unbelievable. The amount of creativity that comes into filmmaking is truly astonishing. And from an audio perspective in this movie, or the visual perspective, the CGI monsters that still look super real and as if they were in person, they don't look that CGI'd, they look fairly real. You feel like those monsters could jump out of the screen and actually attack you. It's insane, the level of detail and perfection. I say perfection because not everything is perfection, but their minds feel like perfection, having to think of these things and make it the best they can, and using creative, unconventional ways to create such an engaging story that has a lot of family dynamic and still has a lot of human emotion while being post-apocalyptic, and a character is deaf, and so there's occasional moments of silence, and using that deafness with a hearing aid to actually beat the creatures and give like a feedback loop that throws off their echolocation. It's incredible, the details and planning and post-production and production that goes into filmmaking. And A Quiet Place is an excellent example of so many areas of film: the writing, the visuals, the audio, the acting, even as kid actors, having kid actors, they are great as well. It's an overall great example of how to tell a good story with all aspects of filmmaking. Some movies, they do really well with one or two things. They don't always do it great throughout. A Quiet Place uses almost or all aspects of filmmaking to make a movie that keeps you easily entertained. So thank you for listening to this episode of Easily Entertained with me, your host, Bryson. If you enjoyed, be sure to tune back in Tuesdays at 5 p.m. Mountain Standard Time for the latest episodes. We're available on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, Amazon Music, YouTube, really anywhere you get your podcasts. And if you want more updates on all the latest things entertainment, join us on Twitter, TikTok, and Instagram. And until next time, this is Easily Entertained.